And if you hear anybody saying that the banking system in Canada is in fact strong, you need to show them this video. Are the Canadian banks in trouble? Because there are some suspicious things that are going on right now that I need to bring to your attention. And we're also going to compare one of these banks to a big bank in the United States so I can show you that, in fact, even though they have beefed up their loan loss provisions, they are still miles away from a US bank. So anyway, let's get into this and discuss what is happening. So CIBC said to explore selling off $360 million of US office loans. So think about that, guys. We know how bad the commercial real estate market is right now. Who on earth wants to buy these loans? So they're trying to sell stuff off at obviously a significant discount, essentially a fire sale if you really think about it. And you've got to ask the question, why are they selling all these loans at a massive loss? And that's exactly what's happening with CIBC. And we're not just seeing this with CIBC, we're seeing this with other banks, and we'll get into that in a minute. So CBRE Group has been hired to find buyers for $360 million of performing and non-performing office loans backed by 8 buildings in cities including San Francisco, Seattle, Phoenix, and Austin, according to marketing materials seen by Bloomberg News. The seller is CIBC, according to a person with knowledge of the matter who asked not to be named because the process is private. So like I said, you've got to ask that question of why on earth they're actually selling the loans, and is it just an isolated case of CIBC that is selling these loans, or are other things happening? Are other banks selling loans that are potentially they're taking a massive haircut on? No, they're not. If you look at BMO, for instance, BMO to close indirect retail auto finance business and also lays people off. So with BMO, the Bank of Montreal, this was a while ago, by the way, but they've winded down indirect retail auto finance business, and Reuters cites that the move comes after BMO's overall bad debt provisions rose to $492 million. Wow, sounds amazing, right? It's up $136 million a year earlier. Unless you put that into the context of what percentage is that of their loan book, then it doesn't really mean anything to you. And I can tell you for all the Canadian banks, it's way less than 1%. And for BMO specifically, they're one of the worst ones where it's around 0.6%. So they have loan loss provisions to cover 0.6% of loans. And you're probably saying, well, Luke, how many of the loans went bad in the US during the financial crisis and housing bubble? And if you go back to JP Morgan, for example, their loans declined from $761 billion to $633 billion. That is a decline of 16%, guys. So they had to write off 16% of their loans, essentially. So even if you said it's going to be around 10%, they are way off with the amount of loan loss provisions that these banks actually are holding. If you look at JP Morgan and you use them as an example, and you look at their loan loss provisions and what happened in 2008, so loan loss provisions actually started rising in 2007, guys. And in September, they were around 19 billion. So they went up substantially, but that was only 1% of their total loans. And then obviously you can see that they skyrocketed after here. Loan loss provisions rising is not a good thing, as we can see with what happened with JP Morgan and Chase. Now, if you look at the Canadian Imperial Bank, for instance, so CIBC, you can see that they have loan loss provisions of around 3.9 billion. And if you look at the total amount of loans that they have 533 billion in loans. So it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out that that is less than 1% of the loans that they have in loan loss provisions. And it's actually around 0.89%. And it's not a lot when you really think about it. Considering JP Morgan had to write off over 16% of loans during the financial crisis, the amount that these banks are holding as loan loss provisions is minuscule. It's a drop in the ocean, essentially. And, you know, a lot of people would say, well, Luke, there's no chance that we're going to have a financial crisis here in Canada. The housing market is rock solid. And the way I would frame it is it's not so much about the housing market as it is about debt. And you can already see the signs, in fact, that the debt bubble is imploding. And we can see those signs everywhere with the economy slowing, banks are tightening up lending, and you can really see that happening. I mean, most of the big banks, their loans have really flattened out over the past quarters, they're really not lending more money, and there's just not more demand for it because people have reached their absolute limit. And if you look at what's happened, debt to GDP has actually fallen in Canada, which is a bad sign, because if you look at the United States, for example, and what happened with debt to GDP during the financial crisis, you can see it went down, it briefly rebounded, and then it went all the way down into this massive deleveraging cycle that happened in the United States. And if you look at Canada, you can see that not only did we get bigger than the bubble in the United States, you can now see that we're coming down, and that is really the first time that we've seen this to this extreme in a long time. So it's indicative of probably what's going to happen. And when you look at household debt to GDP, just look at Canada, number 3 in the world, right behind Australia, which is another place with a massive housing bubble and debt bubble, the same as Canada. And it's just undeniable when you look at these different things. And if you hear anybody saying that the banking system in Canada is in fact strong, you need to show them this video, because how is having 0.89% in your loan loss provisions when you have that many loans, over 500 billion, how on earth is that a prudent thing to do? I mean, right now, for instance, if you compare that to JP Morgan, for instance, so JP Morgan has 1.32 trillion in loans. If you look at loan loss provisions at JP Morgan, they're at 22.42 billion right now, which represents around 1.6%. So it's nearly double that of CIBC, and some of the other banks, it's over triple what the other banks have as loan loss provisions. And if you look at Canadian banks, for example, notice how compared to any other time in history, even in 2020, the loan loss provisions are in fact higher than then. So what does that tell you about what the banks are preparing for? And that's just not something that we see when you look at a JP Morgan, for example. Yeah, their loan loss provisions have gone up. They're nowhere near what they were in 2020 during the depths of the pandemic. And if you go back to 2010, when their loan loss provisions peaked, nowhere near that. So it's kind of crazy when you think about it, because there's all these indications that things are going wrong in the banking system. And then we've also got the repo market, the Bank of Canada having to intervene in the repo market. We talked about this on a live stream a couple of weeks ago. Obviously, if the Bank of Canada is having to step in the repo market and provide liquidity, you have to ask the question, why aren't primary dealers like CIBC, why aren't they stepping in to offer liquidity in the repo market? And the reality is, it's because either they're having liquidity problems themselves, or they're so risk off that they don't want to take on any more securities. And if you think about that, if they're so risk off that they don't want to deal in the repo market, then we have some major issues going on in the financial system. So it's not necessarily that the repo market is a bailout. It's not really a bailout of the financial system. Most of that liquidity is going to hedge funds and other counterparties like pension funds. But when you think about it, it's like I said, you have to ask the question, why aren't they stepping in? Because they make money in the repo market. There's an incentive there for them to make money. And obviously, they don't want to take that. And that could be because they're having liquidity issues, which looks likely to me. And it looks increasingly likely when you look at things like this, that they are having problems. They're having major problems because they are selling these things off, the dirtiest things, at massive losses. So they're taking haircuts. At the end of the day, why don't they wait for these loans to mature? Because I thought these guys were the solid banks. We have such a solid banking system here in Canada. We have nothing to worry about. And I'm not making this video to drum up fear and say eject all your money out of the ATM and go all into cash and hide it under your mattress or anything like that. I'm basically outlining how the financial system is on the verge and nobody even notices. I mean, we have all these loans right now that are in negative amortization, and everybody has talked about it. The Bank of Canada, Caroline Rogers, you've also got the OSFI, which is run by the banksters. That's our regulator, and they've talked about it too, but nobody's really doing anything about it, and they seem to think that it's not a problem. And don't you remember during the financial crisis that subprime was contained, and even though there was risk there, everybody kind of sidelined it and nobody did anything about it? Does that kind of sound familiar to you? Well, that's kind of what's happening in Canada. And Canada has a massive subprime and fraud problem that nobody talks about either. There is a massive amount of fraud in the housing market, an undeniable incredible amount of fraud that I have even shown on this channel. Even the mainstream media caught on and did a documentary about it. CIBC, of all people. So there is a massive fraud problem, and we have unlimited amounts of subprime coming in through the immigration system right now. Canada has a subprime problem, and it has a fraud problem. So it's laughable to even argue that it doesn't have that problem on its own. But the major issue, the core issue, is the fact that Canada is so indebted. When you go to things like household debt to GDP, I know it's not the best measure in the world, but it does show you how bad things are in Canada when it comes to how leveraged households really are. And they're following after the government as well, which is extremely leveraged, and the private sector. There is a massive debt bubble here in Canada, and from all the data that we can see, it looks like that debt bubble is imploding right before our eyes, and that will cause extreme pain because you have an economy that is dependent on leverage, and that's exactly why the economy is slowing down right now. Interest rates are high, the economy depends on leverage, and the banks don't really want to lend into anything remotely risky right now, and nobody even wants to borrow at these high rates. So we have major problems going on right now that are so obvious that nobody talks about it. I mean, when you really boil it down to just the basics here, you've only got to think that when you think of a debt bubble, it relies on the greater fool theory. It relies on people being able to sell assets to a greater fool. And not only that, when you have these debt bubbles as well, it relies on people taking on more and more debt. And as we're seeing, that is starting to slow with at least the big banks, which hold a lot of this toxic debt. And as we know in Canada, most of the debt revolves around mortgages. But when you really think about it, guys, people cannot take on debt by an unlimited amount of money. I mean, even with zero rates, essentially, like we had in 2021, you eventually reach the peak of that. And essentially, we have knocked the door of the peak, and now we're falling fast, and the assets are falling because they're dependent. When you see a home price, just realize that that price is dependent on a person being able to get a loan. Barely anybody is buying with cash in Canada. So those prices are in fact dependent on leverage, dependent on lending, and lending is starting to slow, and the consumer is at the ending point, as we're seeing with credit card debt and many other things. So anyway, I want to thank you so much for watching this video. If you're looking for a VPN to get around Trudeau's censorship laws, go to expressvpn.com/market mania. If you've enjoyed this video, you might like this video here, you might like this playlist here. I will see you in the next one. Take care, guys. Bye-bye.